Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Welcome to Think JSOU. I am Bill Dempsey. I'm the JSOU Academic Chair to the United States Special Operations Command and the Interim Chair to the Naval Special Warfare Command. Several years ago, I had the privilege of sitting in on a presentation by a then Lieutenant Colonel Brian Steed to a group of SOF students at the Command and General Staff College on the topic of concept of maneuver in the narrative space. It was really impressive. I enjoyed it. It really kind of challenged my thinking and certainly has informed my instruction at JSOU here at the Special Warfare Center and School and at various PMEs to both SOF and non-SOF audiences. So I'm privileged again to be able to speak with now Dr. Brian Steed on this important topic. And I think it's vital from a special operations perspective that we understand this concept as we try and achieve those strategic effects, shaping those environments in those complex problems. So Brian, thank you for making the time to be with us. Well, while Brian's getting it, I want to share a couple of slides that I think are helpful to frame our discussion. The first slide you see here is a quote by General Clark to his testimony for Congress, and speaks to the importance of this issue. Particularly want to focus on the second half of this comment. We're going to have to understand how the adversary is thinking, how the population is thinking, and work in these spaces to make sure that the U.S. message and our allies and partners message is being heard and is resonating. So that idea of influence and being able to affect behavior. The second quote I think is even more powerful by General Mattis, this concept of the new high ground, right? For the changing character of war in the information age will require military forces that recognize seizing or controlling terrain is secondary to protecting innocent lives, and that capturing perceptions is the new high ground in today's conflict. I think that captures it very well. And obviously, as military professionals, we appreciate the role of high ground in terms of being able to achieve a success. And then lastly, I want to share a cartoon that I think captures the whole idea of the human domain and the idea of complexity. Give you a second to look at that. Right, we need to get him to move from the 12th century into the 21st century, way over here, while he tries to kill you. So with that, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that we've got Brian with us. Brian, thank you again and appreciate it. We survived the storm, so we'll give it our best shot. What I want to do is start with a question. You and I have talked about this a fair bit. But for our audience, how would you define narrative and its importance, its role as we try and fulfill our responsibilities in support of the national security strategy?
Okay, well, good morning, and I want to thank Bill and John and the whole crew for allowing me to talk about this today. So one of the things that I think is important, and I hope the screen is up. I do find it interesting that there is in fact a doctrinal definition of narrative, and so I want to kind of show that. So this is from the Joint Forces or Joint Publication 324, so the Counterinsurgency Manual at the joint level. And one of the things that I think is so important about understanding narrative, quite often the word gets used in a lot of different meanings. And so I think it's useful to always start back with, what do I mean when I'm talking about it? And in this case, I'm talking about this central idea, this ability. This is sort of your core identity. It's what shapes how you view the world. And just as it says here, it represents your idea, but it's also how you process information. So in that case, I'm a big fan of Ajit Man's work. I work with her on narrative strategies, and she talks about it. This bottom definition for narrative warfare is sort of her approach to understanding narrative, and that it's not about the information, which is how most people talk about narratives, is they talk about them as stories or as information. But narratives aren't the story or aren't the facts. Narratives are how people make meaning of the facts. So for all the public affairs officers who might be listening to this isn't about truth or lies. Quite often we talk about getting truth out before the enemy, or get the truth out first. That isn't what narrative war or narrative warfare is about. It's about understanding how people, whether you could think of it in the target audience sense, but how people process information, how they process those the facts and the details, and how they wrap their heads around it. So narrative is a way to wrap your head around information, or is how people wrap their head around information. So when I talk about narrative space, so I think there's a slide that I used when Bill first saw me talk about it. And I used to talk about it in this way, this idea of competing competitions, that there was a competition of violence and a competition of narrative. And the US tended to prefer the competition of violence because we were good at it. Our competitors like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, I would argue China, they prefer the competition of narrative. And I showed them with these opposite extremes and advantages. And I've now kind of realized that that's kind of an inaccurate portrayal, because it shows that as violence increases, that narrative decreases. Now, I was trying to show here in terms of relative importance, but the way I think it is more accurate is to talk about it this way, that as violence increases, well, one, narrative is always important, and that the more violence goes into a system, the more narrative is critical. We don't have time to talk about the details of this now, but I just want to throw out as sort of food for thought, and who knows, maybe we'll get to do this talk on this specific aspect of it at some future discussion. But if you think about America's single greatest investment in narrative war was during World War II, which is also our greatest investment in violence. So as we ramped up the violence and we went to war, the President of the United States, and even before we declared war, Hollywood, the entertainment industry, decided that we were going to increase our emphasis on the narrative, that we were going to communicate why we were going to war, why it was important for the American people to participate. So some of you might be familiar with the Frank Capra produced movies, Why We Fight. But there were a great many other movies that were produced, some of which were encouraged by the US government and some of which were just independent productions that Hollywood producers decided they were going to do pro-war movies. So I think it's important to recognize conflict. Sometimes narrative is the dominant form of the conflict, and sometimes narrative might appear to be less significant than the violence, but it's always present. And so one of the inverse relationships that I talk to students about, this is going to be an exaggeration, but it's still an important thing to understand, is this aspect of plenty versus understanding. So this will be, I'll have to explain plenty really quickly. So many years ago, I was in the Scout Platoon Leaders course. I was going through a bridge demolitions class where we had to measure the bridge and do calculations on how much explosives were necessary to blow up the bridge. And so there's a calculation for that, and we ran the calculation through, and I showed it. It was an engineer, non-commissioned officer who was leading the class, and so I showed him my final number, and he said, "That's wrong, Lieutenant. And I'm like, and I'll make up a number. I can't remember what it was. It was like, oh, this is going to be 12.4 pounds of C4. And he's like, that's wrong. And I'm like, and I went back and checked the math. I mean, I'm a historian for a reason because I'm not great at math. And I'm like, but I thought it was that good. This wasn't a complicated equation. To look back at it. And he's like, you forgot to add the variable P. And I didn't know what he meant. And I looked at the equation. There was no variable P. And then he explained the great engineer principle that the variable P is for plenty. And so the idea being that when you have plenty of resources as a relative sense with your opponent, then you don't need to have a tremendous amount of understanding. And there's lots of indications of this. One could argue we didn't understand the Japanese narrative very well in World War II. But when you can park 39 aircraft carriers off the island of Okinawa, you probably don't have to understand their narrative very well, right? Because you have plenty of plenty, okay? But when we send a Special Forces A team into a country where it's just 12 dudes running around, those guys need to understand the narrative very well because it's critical that because they have very little plenty. And this is a critical, important thing that they understand. Now, the unfortunate thing is we have this bad habit of not increasing our understanding as we decrease our plenty. So in Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, when we made decisions to not increase force size, we did not at the same time increase our understanding of the plant or of the opponent and of the environment. And so it was quite difficult. Now, just for simplicity's sake, this is not good. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about narrative? And so this is, I started my academic career as a geology student until I ran into chemistry, and then I became a historian. But I love this geologic metaphor. So I use this geologic metaphor that narrative, you have this core identity that people have. There's an enduring narrative that is like the physical terrain that we see on the ground is transformable. It changes over time. We'll talk about some ways that happens. And then there's this transient narrative environment in which we exist that has information and news and rumor and fake news and whatever you're thinking about. All that's the transient narrative environment, right? And that's when you hear media personalities talk about narrative, that's what they mean, is this transient narrative. Okay, now the idea is that this enduring narrative forms for each society. Now you could make the philosophical argument that every human being has a unique enduring narrative. Okay, but that's not very useful when you're talking about 330 million American narratives or 7 billion global narratives, right? So the argument would be that there are societal narratives that exist that express in a broad sense what a given country or society might value. So, for example, you could think of the American dream as the societal narrative for America. Okay, that's a very broad overgeneralization, as these are. Okay, so the idea is every government has a story for how they're going to connect that with that societal narrative. So how they're going to realize this. So we could think of this in a political sense in America, that the president, his administration, has a story for how they're going to solve for the narrative. And when we talk about solve, we'll talk about solving for dissonance in a moment. Okay, so the narrative also serves as a form of filter. So we have transient narrative, information, news, rumor, information, entertainment, right? And something might come at us. We might hear a rumor or a piece of news. And if that's something that fits with our enduring narrative, then we invite that in, that stays with us, and it might slightly adjust our enduring narrative. But if we hear something we flat out reject, or that doesn't meet with our enduring narrative at all, then that thing gets rejected and it gets bounced away almost as if it's sinful or impure. Okay, So I believe that narrative space evolves and changes. So one of my favorite geology classes was on geomorphology. So it's a study of how the terrain came to be the way it is. So when you look at a mountain or you look at the Grand Canyon, for example, how did that happen? And anyway, that's just a fascinating thing. And I love that about geology. And I think that those same processes apply in narrative. And so the narrative space has terrain, and that terrain develops and evolves over time through the same three main processes that the physical landscape evolves. So there's erosional, depositional, and tectonic forces that change things. So depositional means it's something that reinforces the existing narrative. Erosional would be something that challenges the existing narrative. And then tectonic is something that can have tremendous, almost immediate transformation of the narrative space. Now, when we think about that, if you're familiar with the geologic properties of tectonic forces, then you would appreciate that seismic and volcanic forces or seismic and volcanic events are not, they're not just events immediately. So when a large earthquake shifts the ground significantly, that's not because of that 1 minute. It's actually because of millions of years of tension that have existed in that fault. And then all of a sudden, in a moment, it slips, right? So most of us just see the slip. We don't, because it's almost impossible for the human eye to perceive all the millions of years of tension that have existed that allow that slip to be so transformative. The same thing is true of narrative space. So I think one of the great tectonic narrative events that have happened in most of our lifetime was the US invasion of Iraq. So we invaded Iraq. That created a massive transformation in the Iraqi narrative space, not just because we invaded and toppled the government, but because of all that pre-existing tension that was present in Iraq that most of us were ignorant about prior to our toppling that government. So we did not appreciate the tensions and how those would be released. Okay. So I give all this to say that there's obviously a lot more we can go into, but I want to have as much time as possible for discussion. But in this idea of narrative space, this is a slide I did many years ago to try to get across this notion that we need to think about narrative space a little bit differently than we think about physical space or cyberspace. But we also need to recognize at the same time that narrative space includes all of that. It is a combination of our words, our deeds, our images. So everything we say, everything we do, everything we show functions in the narrative, is part of narrative space. So when a soldier does something offensive in a culture, that action influences the narrative space. It's either going to, depending, and we'll address this in just a second, but depending on how we're perceived in that environment, that will either be a depositional event or an erosional event, as it confirms what people perceive us to be, or it challenges how people perceive us. Okay, so to get back to this sort of geologic globe idea, right? So we talk about there's a societal narrative, there's a governing story, and like, as you see here, there's always a gap. There's always some existing disruption, okay? And so narrative entrepreneurs, which was a fancy name that I came up with for guys like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or Hamas or the Taliban, or to a degree when it comes to the global narrative, China or Russia, what they're trying to do is they're trying to do two things. One, they want to increase the dissonance that exists between the governing story and the societal narrative. And the second thing they want to do is they want to interpose their story between the governing story and the societal narrative. So in simple sense, what the Taliban wanted to do was say, so like in a simplistic sense, the Afghan societal narrative could be said as Afghans are Muslim and Afghans fight the external invader, right? Like that could be a 2-sentence description of the Afghan narrative. So what the Taliban want to say is we are more Muslim than the Afghan national government, and that we, the Taliban, are more involved in fighting the outside invader than is the Afghan national government. And of course, I expect everybody listening here would see, well, both of those things are obvious, even though the Taliban did have a less popular interpretation of Islam. Everybody recognized their interpretation of Islam as being Islam, right? Whereas it wasn't so clear that everything the Afghan national government was trying to do was appropriately Islam. And it was obvious that the Taliban were fighting the outside invader and that the Afghan national government was allied with the outside invader. So that was an easy story for the Taliban to tell. So that gets as a simple description of what we're talking about. So when we talk about how this all works, one, there's disruption. And so as I just mentioned, there's always disruption. It always exists, right? Because no government is perfect, so there's always some disruption. Then the various actors in this space that are in opposition to the governing story try to increase that disruption, right? And then ideally increase that disruption to the point of displacing it. And then they want to put themselves in the middle so that they're perceived as being closer. And then once again, trying to displace that with a goal of exhausting that stronger opponent. So here's some questions I think that we all have to go through if we're going to function well in this narrative environment. One is we have to understand what the societal narrative is of any society with which we're interacting, right? The other is we need to understand what the governing story is. So if we're going to another country, we need to understand what the governing story is of our partner that we're working with, and how that organization actually stays in power. And then we need to recognize how well that story that the government has been telling, how well that is resonating with the societal narrative. Is that something that everybody sort of believes in, or is it viewed as they're corrupt, there's a problem, you know, like how great is that disruption, or how great is the resonance? And then finally, we've got to understand where we fit in this whole disruption resonance thing. Are we the good guys? Are we the bad guys? And not like, what are we in our own mind? It's what are we in their mind, like in that local societal narrative, like where is this? That's something we should have realized going into Iraq, that we were not going to be automatically perceived as liberators because we were already the bad guys. Now, maybe we could do an erosion, we could do a variety of things that would erode that aspect of the narrative and reform a different channel where we are the good guys, right? But we have to understand what the pre-existing channel is to know how much we need to change it, or whether or not we are the good guys already, and we just have to keep depositing material to make sure that that narrative stays intact. So this is, like, to me, this is all part of what we have to wrap our heads around. And we could go into some of the most specific things. So I guess I kind of want to jump into Russia just really briefly and then jump into China. But in terms of applying this to what's going on right now, like one of the things I would say, and I think it's a fascinating discussion. There's a lot of things going on and I'm sure everybody's watching the news reports about Ukraine. So I'm not, I was very, very leery when people were quickly declaring Putin a loser and that this thing had failed in the first couple of days. I'm still not sure that the Russians have failed in a large sense. They certainly have failed in certain aspects, right? But then what's important is to recognize what was Putin trying to do and how did his narrative fit into that. One of the things I think is that Putin misread the regional and even the Ukrainian narrative environment. Like, he did not understand the narrative space. He didn't recognize, if you go back to this previous one, if you reword question 4, he didn't recognize where the Russian culture and the Russian military fit within Ukrainian resonance or dissonance. He thought that 2022 was like 2014, and that the Ukrainians would not oppose the Russians, and that instead the Ukrainian government would collapse. Or this is what I think he was perceiving. I think he also misread his own narrative environment, in the sense that this gets in the truth and lies things, right? That his narrative space, he was powerful. And this gets into the Russian narrative, right? That the Russians are beset by enemies. This comes all the way from George Kennan's stuff in 1946 and 47. He perceived that NATO was the aggressor, and the Russians, of course, are always the honorable defender. Even if they're on the offense, they're on the offense because that's what's necessary to defend Russia and Russian interests and the honorable Russian people. And I think Putin misread this narrative environment. And once again, he misread it on both sides. He misread his own military narrative environment, where at least reports now are coming out that maybe he was deceived, or more importantly, people didn't speak truth to power in where the Russian military actually stood. But it's clear that he misread the Ukrainian narrative, and he also misread the NATO narrative. Now, part of that you might not blame him for, because NATO did look pretty ineffectual and pretty disintegrated, and they've shown themselves to be way more united. I certainly don't expect that he imagined that the Germans would stop Nord Stream 2 on account of this action. So he misread that, right? So this is, to me, this gets at this importance of recognizing the narrative space sort of as a terrain, how to read that narrative map so that you can interpret it properly. And just like with any map, there's an interpretation level to it. And certain people can misinterpret what that means. And I just want to jump into China as a part of this. So obviously the Chinese number one narrative is that they are the Middle Kingdom. And most people listening to this probably are aware of this. But just to be clear, the Middle Kingdom in this narrative is not middle as in average, or it's middle as in central and most critical to that kind of middle. Everything flows through China, everything flows to China, and everything flows from China. And that's China's proper role in the world. And so China is trying to address that. And by the way, I'm not saying this to defend their narrative, right? I'm just saying this to explain this. So and of course, it also believes that everybody they want to establish a unified Han Chinese narrative. Like, everybody in China is Han Chinese. So when we talk about Tibetans in the West, like, the CCP will reject that. There are no Tibetans, just like with Uyghurs. There are no Uyghurs. There are only Han Chinese. And if there are people who think they're Uyghurs when there aren't any Uyghurs, then these people are confused and they need to be re-educated. And if they refuse that re-education, then these are people that need to have more stringent re-education, to the point of punishment, and maybe even to the point of reduction of resources in the sense of food and so forth. Like, we interpret this as genocide, and had a discussion with a scholar on genocide yesterday, and I get the point that definitionally you can make this argument that it is genocide, but I also recognize why the Chinese do not see it as such, because this is an issue of people who do not recognize who they really are. There are no Hong Kongers, there are no Taiwanese, they're all just Han Chinese, and they need to be informed of that. And so China uses their social media, they use physical force, they use cultural transformation to get at this dynamic. Now, I think this is really well articulated in a 1988 paper written by Wang Huning, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing anything Chinese in this, but And he's a guy who has been characterized, and I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable on Chinese politics to know how true this is, but that he's one of these men behind the throne. Like he's a significant power player for the current and the previous two premiers of China. And he talked about it in '88, that the biggest threat to China was internal division. And he talks about the importance, and in this case, internal division caused by Western cultural imperialism. And so that must be refuted. And so what you're seeing over the last several years is the Chinese media empire has grown, is their emphasis on teaching people what it is to be properly Han Chinese. So I really strongly encourage my students to watch the movie Wolf Warrior, the 2015 movie, as a way to understand what is trying to be articulated. I'm not going to go into all the details because I could spend a long time on this, because I think it's a fascinating discussion on what it is. I don't know if Bill wants to go down that road. We can talk about it. It's not a great film for those of you guys who are going to watch it as a result of this recommendation. It's kind of like an 80s action adventure. So this isn't, this isn't some artistic, Citizen Kane or even, Apocalypse Now. This is sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger Commando, but it's done with Chinese, and it's trying to emphasize what the proper Chinese man is supposed to be. And the 2021 film that's shown on this slide is I think it's Lake Changqing is how it's said. Anyway, but it's the Chosin Reservoir fight. And this is now, as my understanding is, I think this was the most successful film in Chinese history. Before that movie came out in 2021, the most successful film in Chinese history was Wolf Warrior from 2015. Okay, so part of what I think is useful to talk about is like, how well is this doing? So how effectively are they in this narrative war? And so if their narrative is China is the Middle Kingdom, here is this famous clip. Most of you are probably familiar with it, of John Cena apologizing for the egregious offense of saying that Taiwan is the first country that can watch F9. And so in Chinese, he does a 68-second apology. Basically, he is kowtowing to the Middle Kingdom and saying, "Oh, I made a mistake. I am so sorry." I think he actually says so 4 times. But it's quite a groveling apology by a person who is considered to be, like from a Western perspective, like this is the man's man, right? This is the idea of the pinnacle of physical masculinity, right? And yet he is acknowledging China as the Middle Kingdom. Another example that came out in this 2022 Olympics is Elaine Gu, who is born in San Francisco, raised entirely in America, and then announces, I think in 2019, she announced that she was going to compete for China, which is where her mother was born, or maybe both her parents. I can't remember now. But why would she do that? Well, partly because she is effectively acknowledging China as the Middle Kingdom. And therefore, and she doesn't see America as superior to that. Why compete for America? Because, and this is part of China's narrative war, right? Like to denigrate America. So another person that acknowledges China as the Middle Kingdom is LeBron James, because he will criticize American racism while at the same time praising China, which is manifestly a much more racist culture and much more racist country. But he does that. And once again, I don't know that whether he recognizes this is what he's doing consciously, intentionally or not, but effectively what he's doing is performing a part of this narrative war, acknowledging China as the Middle Kingdom. So you see these famous, a world-class athlete won a gold medal, so the best at her game, a very successful actor in John Cena, and arguably, at least he considers himself the greatest of all times when it comes to basketball player, who are all Americans who are acknowledging China as the Middle Kingdom. And then, of course, one of the greatest films, I guess, in a Wolf Warrior sense, from the 80s, Top Gun, right? So the Top Gun picture, that's Maverick's patch on the back of his jacket in the 1986 release. And then I think it's going to be released in 2022, the Top Gun Maverick. And you see that the patch has changed, and the patch removes the flag of Taiwan and it removes the flag of Japan. And ostensibly, nobody has come out and definitively made this statement, but the argument that has been made is it's been done so that the movie would be released in China. And what China's trying to do narratively is trying to effectively unperson Taiwan. And it goes back to my point, right? Taiwan, there is no such thing as the Taiwanese. They're just Han Chinese, and they need to get with the program. And so what China wants to do is unperson them, so the rest of the world forgets that there is such a thing as the Taiwanese, much as they want us to forget that there are Tibetans or Hong Kongers or Uyghurs. Okay, so that was a really, really long pitch, and I'm happy to go back and discuss this as any aspect of this. But my point, I guess, is understanding, one, that narrative war is a thing, right? Like, this is so important, as I'm skipping back through all this, to recognize that narrative war is the way war is being fought, right? Influences the engagement. Maneuver is happening in through cognition, or maneuver is cognitive, and that the conflict is constant. I would make the argument that I think China always thinks they're at war, or they're always at conflict. Sometimes, very, very few times, that conflict might involve weapons. But all of these things, so John Cena's apology, Elaine Gu's competing for China and winning a gold medal, Tom Cruise changing the patch on his jacket. These are all engagements in a narrative war. We might, once again, think that they're trivial engagements, and maybe to a degree, they might have some level of triviality, but when they add up, thing after thing after thing, it gets pretty significant. A lot of people recognize China and Chinese culture. During COVID, a whole lot of people recognized Chinese culture and their way of dealing with COVID as maybe superior to an American approach. And a great many people tried to emulate what China did in the early weeks and months of COVID in American policies, right? Like, these are all ways that demonstrate that they're winning, because in their mind, if they win the narrative war, and this goes back to the famous Sun Tzu element, right? Like, the acme of skill is to win the battle without fighting, is to set yourself up. And we use the game Go, and I know it has a different name and I can never forget its proper name, but we use the game Go, or I do with my students, to talk about how the Chinese look at strategy, because I think strategy games, cultural strategy games, are really important to wrap your heads around people. And if you set the conditions properly in the game Go, then your opponent won't even move to a certain place or a certain space, because in their mind, that space is now forbidden to them. It's not acceptable that they go there. And that is the one, I think that's what Sun Tzu is getting at when he talks about the acme of skill is achieving that kind of position. But I also think the second element is that this is what China's trying to do. They're trying to set the conditions. Like, they don't want to fight over Taiwan, as an example. They want Taiwan to just choose to be Chinese, and then the rest of us just accept that choice. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and then we'll go to wherever Bill, you want to take us.
We've got a number of, you've given us a lot of information to kind of chew on, and we've got a couple of questions that we've got a couple questions that are from the audience that we'll get your thoughts on. And the first is this idea of truth versus interpretation, and that idea of meaning is really more important than facts. One of the questions is like, you know, the idea that NATO as an offensive organization, it could be, you know, you could say that it's provably false by history, but that really is not what's important. Can you kind of comment on this truth versus interpretation?
Well, okay, so I'm going to sound, I'm going to use this sort of sense, this almost a woke terminology, like my truth versus, and I think that there's an element that is true. So when I talk to my students about this, there are elements of this notion of multiple truths that is important when you're dealing with international relations. I don't think it's particularly useful when you're dealing with domestic society, because ideally we want everybody, we want to be cohesive in our country. So we want to have a common agreement about facts and about objective things, objective truth. But when you're dealing with other cultures and you're dealing with international relations, I think you have to recognize that there isn't one interpretation, right? We, as in the United States of America, we wrote the rules by which the world functions, in part because we wrote the rules that became instantiated in the UN Charter and that govern UN actions. And even though we don't participate in it, the International Criminal Court is based effectively on Western law, maybe not specifically American case law, but certainly is based off of Western legal principles and ideas. So it's important to recognize that, because then you get why people have these other ideas. So I talk about mirror imaging. In fact, I'm now going to reshare my screen and go to the mirror imaging side, because I think it's important to get at this notion of mirror imaging as I get to that. Okay, so let me go to the last and back up. Okay, so when we think about mirror imaging, it's important to recognize that when red looks at blue or blue looks at red, they're not actually seeing blue or red, right? They're just seeing themselves, right? Red sees red in the mirror and blue sees blue in the mirror, even though blue thinks they're interpreting red. And now we all mirror image, and a great many psychologists have done tremendous research on this. Like, we have to mirror image, right? Like, we can't function if we don't. So I'm not saying that mirror imaging is bad, but there are times where mirror imaging is bad. And one of the keys is to recognize when it is bad and when it isn't. And so that's why, to me, this narrative stuff helps you, that when you recognize how different the narrative is, then you can recognize the efficacy or lack of efficacy with respect to mirror imaging. So I don't think you can effectively mirror image the Russians like Americans can. Like, you have to look at how they see the world. And this is why I thought George Kennan's, like, I think his article, his whether it's the sources of Soviet conduct or it's the long telegram which preceded it, and that the sources of Soviet conduct is based off of, that those pieces are so profoundly important, because Kennan starts, he doesn't word it this way, but he starts by laying out the Soviet narrative and how that narrative develops. So he gives you sort of a geomorphology of the Soviet narrative. Here's what it is, and here's how that developed over time. And so if you understand that, you know, from a Stalin perspective, and I would argue now from a Putin perspective, it's not paranoia, because from their perspective, the world really is out to get them. They've always been out to get them ever since they were a little principality, you know, in then, as they called it, Kiev, and that little kingdom of Rus that existed, and they were always beset by the Tartars, by whoever it was, the Huns, whoever they had to deal with. They were always under attack, right? And so if you understand that world, then you can see why when the Soviet Union disintegrates in 1991, and then NATO from their perspective, almost immediately starts marching east, you can see how that feeds that innate societal paranoia that, in fact, NATO is the aggressor because NATO has aggressed, and there are objective facts that support that interpretation. We can say that, oh, well, NATO isn't ever going to attack Russia, but if you believe that, well, and this is the other part, right, that NATO limits this concept of attack to one of military violence. If you have this concept that any form of attack, right, like in the sense of, say, cultural imperialism, so rock and roll, blue jeans, Coca-Cola, whatever, Radio Free Europe, that these are all forms of attack. And then you can see from their perspective, they've been attacked many, many times. And now anything they're doing now is just defensive. They're trying to defend against this aggression that's been heaped on them now for, I don't know, 70 years that the Russians have been under attack from that perspective. So when we talk about, well, a lot of times when we, and I mean, sort of writ large, the national security community talks about narrative or narrative warfare or narrative war, a lot of times we think we're behind China and Russia, that they are the ones who are leading this and that we're trying to catch up. But from China and Russia's perspective, this has been something that they believe we started, and they're in fact just doing what we were always doing. So for example, Putin will make the argument that we, the West, had a color revolution in Ukraine in 2014, which was a coup. That's how he describes it. And that it was a form of American, he doesn't use this term, but it was a form of American narrative war, Western narrative war that overthrew the rightfully elected president, put in eventually Zelensky, who is just a Western puppet. And what Putin's trying to do is reestablish the Russian, or reestablish the right government, the government that was properly elected to be in charge, right? And I'm not arguing, this goes back to, like, I'm not arguing who is right or who is wrong. I do the same thing with ISIS. This isn't, to me, whether or not a group like ISIS is properly Muslim or whatever else. I'm not qualified to enter that debate properly. My point is, this is how, in this case, Russia sees the world. And if you're going to fight that, then you need to recognize how that narrative terrain exists so that you recognize, okay, here's where we need to erode that narrative. Here's where we need to deposit on that narrative. Or are we willing to just shake things up with some tectonic event, like as we have done? And I don't know how tectonic the sanctions will be, but the sanctions, I think, could qualify as tectonic events. Anyway, that's a long, I expect all my answers are going to be long. So.
No, that's great. And I think it speaks to that idea of interpretation is really what matters. Meaning is what really matters. And we're talking about the whole idea of identity here. You know, in SOF, we talk about, I can't remember the formal title, but kind of that four-quadrant analysis of how does ACA, how does ACB, how does BCA, and how does BCB, that we're required in these complex problems to kind of look at all four pieces. One of the things I wanted to kind of pull a little string on is this idea of plenty and understanding. And as I look at Iraq, the Anbar Awakening, you know, where we got away from, you know, we'd be in like the 12th Battle of Fallujah if we'd have continued with the same course, but we, you know, whether or not it was intentional or just dumb luck and we weren't too stupid to miss the opportunity, we were able to leverage that gap that you describe in terms of how AQI saw society and how the Sunni tribes in Anbar saw it, and we were able to get in there and partner with them much more effectively with less kinetic effort, primarily for a narrative effort. Get your thoughts on that.
One, absolutely true. I'm a huge fan of
Carter Malkation's book, Illusions of Victory. So he gives 3 reasons for why the surge worked and 3 reasons for why it failed. And when he's talking about why it worked, he's talking the 2006-2009 period, and why it failed, he's talking the 2011-ish to 2014 and the rise of ISIS portion. And he gives basically, these are his summary of his 3 lessons, and it's a great book, and I really recommend it. And I think I make the argument to my students, and I think this is true of all the serving soft guys. This is the most important military event in their lifetime, is the surge, and how that happened, why it worked, why it didn't work. So few people understand it. Malkation, I think, in this book captures some of the nuances particularly well. But I think that 3rd bullet on the success side is really this is the hardest part with understanding, right? Like what Malkation points out is that there were groups who were willing to work together to fight ISIS, and I call AQI ISIS for simplicity's sake, but to fight ISIS in 06, 07, 08, who were not willing to band together in 04, 05, or even early 06, or who were not willing to band together again in 11, 12, or 13. And this gets into like just how nuanced and the level of detail that if you're truly going to be great at this, that you have to understand is what binds people together in opposition to our opponents. What creates that weird combination that may only exist for a relatively limited moment in time. And why does that exist at that moment in time, right? I just don't think, well, in fact, I know we don't spend enough time getting at that level of detail, partly because that gets hard, right? Like it's hard, and my students regularly complain like, oh, you're telling us we need to know everything, and you don't really need to know everything. But when you are deploying to a specific area, dealing with a very specific problem set, that's when you must drill down, and the more you can know about these particular aspects, about why certain narratives will work together and to form a greater, like why a certain, say, a tribal narrative will work together in a more regional way to fight another regional narrative, why that might occur in a given space and time is requires a level of specificity of study that we rarely get to. And I would say we rarely get to it because we rarely emphasize its importance.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. The another thing I wanted to touch on and kind of pull the string on is this idea, and a question came up from the audience. If whether or not Cena and the skier and LeBron are not just chasing the money, you know, kind of Hollywood doing it for financial and China leveraging our capitalistic system. But my personal thoughts are that that's almost secondary. You know, it provides an opportunity, but at the end of the day, you're either a witting or an unwitting agent of the narrative. Your thoughts?
Yeah, amen. It doesn't matter to China why you acknowledge them as Middle Kingdom. They just care that you acknowledge them as Middle Kingdom. If you're doing it for the money, great. If you're doing it because you really, really, really believe in what they're doing, I guess that's better. But I don't think they care.
Right. And we got a question about Middle Kingdom, and I'm just going to defer folks that they can do a little research on their own in terms of this perspective of Middle Kingdom. I also want to talk as we're winding down here, this whole idea of the relationship between violence and narrative, and I like to use the idea of the American Revolution, where you had the Continental Army with Washington, but it really wasn't going to get the job done without Thomas Paine and common sense that provided the justification for this change, you know, this change of identity from British colonists to Americans. And so
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, well, and it gets into right, like that Washington believes that for the war to work, for this revolution to work, I guess the revolution is, and this gets into the weirdness of war, right? Which is why I talk about narrative war, because I think narrative war is much more comprehensive than war as we often talk about it, because that whole revolution is a narrative war. The fighting, the battles or whatever else are part of just the military component of it. And what Washington recognized for the narrative to play out and be successful is that he had to maintain a continental army. There had to be some unifying organization that allowed everybody, that sort of I was going to say encapsulated, I guess, the notion of what America was. Like it had to exist in this sort of embodiment, and the embodiment was the Continental Army, which is why he never wanted to go into a guerrilla environment, or he always wanted to make sure, because he didn't believe a nation could exist absent the existence of national institutions, an army being one of them. And I think this does get at this importance of the narrative, even in that initial one. And this gets at why I think narrative should be intuitive to us, but there's a lot of things that ought to be intuitive to Americans, but aren't. But we were born by success in narrative war. Like there's no way we beat the British militarily. Like we beat them narratively.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I always joke with my PhD friends that, can you help me understand, was Washington a Maoist, or was Mao a Washingtonian? You know, if you pull the string on it, they recognize that ultimately there's going to be a war movement, but they couldn't get there without kind of establishing that narrative.
Yeah, yeah.
So okay, and
so that's
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's probably a deeper discussion for another time, but that's a great discussion point.
Yeah, and then one of the things that we talk about, this idea that we're looking at here, and integral to kind of our soft planning, is looking at cognitive avenues of approach. You know, recognizing what the terrain really is. Is it permissive? Is it semi restrictive? Is it highly restrictive? And that speaks to the layers of the narrative with the permanent versus the transitory.
Well, and I think it gets at this idea of seeing narrative as a space, as that has terrain. There is narrative key terrain. There is narrative decisive terrain, and you have to understand that. And I would agree that there are narrative avenues of approach. There are things that are going to work with certain societies, and these aren't necessarily universal. And we didn't really address it here, and I don't want to go deep into it because we just don't have the time. But oftentimes I will use American domestic politics as a way to talk about this, because we tend to understand the background, right? But for those who are familiar with American domestic politics, you can recognize the value, the narrative key terrain, if you will, in terms of vocabulary. So the left often will use the word equity, the right will often use the word liberty. And those are words that have slightly different meanings, but generally kind of mean mostly similar things. But yet they have like their key terrain for both sides, and they both want to stake out whether this is freedom or liberty or equity, or, and you just think about those key words. Politicians, by definition, are great at maneuvering in the narrative space because that's what their life is, right? Like they don't have a kinetic option, really. And so it's all narrative all the time because they're sort of stuck in that environment, unless you're in other countries where you use violence quite often. So that's.
Or at the Oscars. But that's
yeah, or yeah.
Yeah. All right. I know we're winding down here. Do you want to talk briefly? You and I talked earlier about the relationship between the narrative space, the physical space, and the role of cyberspace.
Okay, so this is so my radical position is that I don't believe that cyberspace is a domain. right? And the reason why I don't believe that cyberspace is a domain, and I don't know what the right domain would be. I think it's cognition, right? I don't even think it's information. But because I think information is just the stuff that moves through the domain. Cyberspace is the infrastructure. So what infrastructure is to the land domain, cyberspace is to the cognitive domain. It's just the electrical lines, it's the plumbing, it's the sewage system, it's the road network, it's all those things. And we don't talk about that in the land domain as a separate domain. We just acknowledge those are things we have to understand. So cyberspace is a conduit through which information flows. It's a conduit through which a lot of people perceive the world. But part of the challenge with cyberspace, and particularly cyber war, is we often portray cyber war as sort of an old school electronic warfare environment where it's all about collecting or jamming. So we want to gather data from using that medium, or we want to prevent the enemy from sharing data or communicating data. And those are certainly elements of a narrative war as well as cyber war. But this to me, like what is truly cyber war, like at a holistic level, is what China is doing, both internally and externally. So the examples I gave of Elaine Gu and John Cena and LeBron James and Top Gun are all examples of cyber war or narrative war writ large. But if we're going to talk about cyber and really believe that it is a domain, then cyber war, that's what cyber war looks like. The fact that China is using social media to try to transform individual behavior, as well as American companies trying to do similar things. This is cyber war. The jamming and collecting is just a really technical and very military application of those tools. But the broader societal shaping events, I think, are actually more permanent and have greater impact.
Oh, great. Well, I know we've exhausted our hour and we've generated additional thoughts and questions. I'm hopeful that we can impose on you to do this again at some point in the future. As we conclude, one of the things that I think is very important is recognizing that everything we do, particularly in SOF, we should understand its impact on the narrative. We should understand its influence, effect, because it doesn't matter if it's shoot somebody in the face or build a schoolhouse. The act itself is quite frankly secondary to its narrative / influence effect. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue to improve our emphasis on that and kind of take advantage of your research and your thoughts. And again, I just want to thank you. I appreciate it. And if there are any questions, certainly I suppose you'd be interested in folks reaching out to you. We've posted the links to your web presence, and you can always reach back to us at JSOU, and we'll see if we can do it justice. So Brian, any closing thoughts before we turn it back over to John?
Well, there's a quote from Dmitry Kiselev that I like. He's a Russian news anchor. I don't know if he currently is, but he was several years ago. And he makes this comment to support your comment. If you can persuade a person, you don't need to kill him. And so that's absolutely true. And this is all about if you can get people to agree with you, then there is no need to advance it to the kinetic violence. But it's all, I would argue, part of this war and this conflict that always happens. And I guess, secondly, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic opportunity. I would love to do it again. And third, absolutely, I would be willing to answer questions or engage with people beyond this. So thank you to JSOU, thank you to Bill, and to all those who have tuned in.